The morning Myrtle Fairchild drove 11 steers into Caldwell, Kansas. She knew every man at that cattle market would try to take them from her one way or another. It was the autumn of 1882, and the air along the Kishom Trail had gone sharp with the smell of dried grass and river mud, and the particular kind of dust that clung to a woman's skirt and made her look like she had no business being anywhere near a cattle pen. Myrtle had risen before dawn to load her wagon with the papers she needed, the brand registry her late husband Horace had filed with the county clerk 3 years prior, and a biscuit she had wrapped in cloth because she knew she would not have time to eat properly once the day began. She was 31 years old, dark-haired and sun-browned, with steady brown eyes that had cried themselves dry over the past 8 months and were now simply watchful. She was not a fragile woman. She had never been a fragile woman. But she was a widow, and in Caldwell in 1882, that word carried a particular weight that no court document or brand registry or deed of ownership seemed able to fully lift. Horace Fairchild had died in February of that year, not dramatically, not at the end of a gun or beneath the hooves of a spooked horse, but quietly, of a fever that came on a Tuesday and took him by Friday. He had been 44 years old and healthy as a plow ox the week before, and then he was gone, and Myrtle was left with 340 acres of hard Kansas land, a farmhouse that needed a new roof, 2 ranch hands who quit within the month because they did not believe a woman could run the operation, a daughter named Pearl who was 9 years old and serious as a judge, and 11 head of cattle that Horace had been planning to sell at the fall market in Caldwell. She had kept those steers alive through the summer. She had mended the fence line herself, 3 miles of it, with Pearl riding alongside her on the old sorrel mare passing wire and post. She had hired a single hand, a quiet Mexican man named Emilio Vega who had worked with Horace before and who never once questioned whether she knew what she was doing, because he could see plainly that she did. Together the 3 of them had brought the steers through the summer heat and the dry spell in August that had cracked the earth and threatened the water supply, and by September the animals were fat and clean-coated and worth good money. Myrtle had calculated that if she sold them at fair market price, she would have enough to repair the roof, pay Emilio through the winter, buy seed for next spring, and put a modest sum aside that would keep her and Pearl through any lean stretch that followed. It was not a comfortable margin, but it was enough if things went fairly. She had learned by then that things did not always go fairly for a woman standing alone. She arrived at the Caldwell Livestock Exchange before 7 in the morning, the steers moving well behind the wagon on lead ropes, with Emilio managing them from horseback. The exchange was a broad, unpainted structure on the south end of town, surrounded by penning yards that smelled of manure and sawdust, and the iron rust scent of the metal gates. Men were already gathered in clusters, buyers and sellers alike, some with coffee in tin cups, some with ledgers already open in their hands. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Clyde Holt, stood near the main gate with his hat pushed back on his head and a pencil tucked behind his ear. Myrtle climbed down from the wagon and straightened her skirt and walked toward him. Clyde Holt looked at her the way men looked at women who appeared in places they did not expect them. Not unkindly precisely, but with a sort of slow, blinking surprise, as though he needed a moment to rearrange his understanding of the morning. "Ma'am," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Holt," she said. "I have 11 steers to register for today's auction. Fairchild brand number registered with the county. I have the paperwork here." She held out the folder. He took it, glanced at it, and glanced back at the steers in the yard, and then at Emilio, and then at her. "These are your animals," he said. "They are," she said. There was a pause that lasted a beat too long. "And your husband, he is dead," she said, because she had learned that drawing it out did not make it easier. "Since February. The brand and the livestock are registered to the Fairchild Ranch, which I now operate. The deed of ownership and the county registry are both in that folder." Clyde Holt read through the paperwork more slowly than the situation required, and Myrtle stood still and let him read it, because she had nothing to be nervous about and she wanted that to be plain in her posture. Finally he nodded, made a mark in his ledger, and handed the folder back to her. "I will put you in the afternoon draw," he said. "Pen number 7. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to Emilio and told him the pen number, and he began moving the steers toward it, and Myrtle turned to survey the yard. She had expected resistance from the auctioneer, and had found less than she anticipated, which was a small victory. What she had not anticipated was the gathering attention of the other sellers and buyers who had witnessed the exchange, the low murmur that passed through the groups of men standing at the fence lines, the sideways looks, the deliberate half-turned conversations. A pair of ranchers near the south gate were watching her with unconcealed skepticism. One of them, a heavy-set man with a blonde mustache and small eyes, stepped toward the fence as she passed and said, loud enough to carry, "Those are some fine animals for a widow woman to have kept up on her own." The word widow had been put in his voice the same way you put a stone in a sling, aimed. Myrtle did not stop walking. "I had help," she said pleasantly. "Good fencing and good water and a man who knew what he was doing. The same things any rancher needs." She heard laughter behind her, and she did not know if it was at her or at the heavy-set man, and she decided it did not matter either way. She settled at the fence rail of pen 7, and watched Emilio get the steers situated and waited for the morning to pass. She had brought her paperwork and her biscuit and a small notebook in which she had written down comparable prices from the last 3 auctions she had found reported in the Caldwell commercial newspaper. She ate the biscuit standing at the rail and looked over her notes and did the arithmetic again in the margins. She was methodical. Horace had always said she was the better bookkeeper of the 2 of them, and she had never disagreed. The morning auctions ran their course. She watched the prices being called, listened to how the crowd responded, gauged the mood. It was a fair market day, good attendance, good stock. Prices were holding. Her 11 steers were well fed, healthy, and correctly branded. There was no logical reason they should sell for less than fair value. She knew, however, that logic was not always the governing force at a cattle auction. Walter Chandler arrived at the Caldwell Livestock Exchange at 9:30 in the morning, which was later than he intended, because his horse had thrown a shoe on the road south of town, and he had walked the animal the last mile rather than risk a lame ride. He was 35 years old, lean and broad-shouldered with dark reddish hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that suggested he had been outdoors in hard weather for most of his adult life, which he had. He ran a spread of about 500 acres northeast of Caldwell, cattle mostly, with a small wheat operation that his father had started and that Walter had maintained out of a combination of habit and genuine affection for watching grain grow. He had been ranching independently for 6 years, since his father passed and his older brother had taken the Chicago money route instead, and he was good at it, not flashy, not famous, but competent and fair in his dealings, which in Caldwell was a reputation worth having. He left his horse at the farrier at the edge of town and walked to the exchange on foot, his ledger under one arm and his hat pulled against the October wind. He was looking to buy 2 or 3 steers to round out a section of his herd, nothing complicated, and he expected the morning to be straightforward. He came through the main gate and stopped at the water trough to fill his canteen, and it was from that position, slightly elevated on the wooden step beside the trough, that he first saw the woman at pen 7. She was standing at the fence rail with a small notebook in her hand, making notes with a pencil, and the steers behind her were 11 of the finest-looking animals he had seen in this year's market. Fat without being overweight, clean-coated, good-tempered from the look of how they stood. He was a man who noticed cattle the way some men noticed horses or dogs, with an automatic and appreciative eye, and these animals caught his attention immediately. Then he noticed the conversations around him. 3 men near the water trough were talking with their voices lowered but not lowered enough, and he caught the thread of it without trying. The widow woman. Those aren't her animals. No widow runs 11 steers through a summer like that. Where would she even get the money to keep them? Probably her dead husband's hands ran them, and she just showed up to collect. Walter filled his canteen and listened and said nothing, because he was a man who understood the value of hearing the whole conversation before entering it. He looked at the woman again. She was reading her notebook with an expression of complete concentration, unaware of or unbothered by what was being said 24 yards away. She turned a page. She made a calculation in the margin. A Mexican hand was moving around inside the pen, checking the animal's legs with the practiced ease of someone who knew what he was looking at. Walter walked to where Clyde Holt was standing near the auction board and looked at the day's listings. "The Fairchild lot," he said, pointing to pen 7 on the board. "What time does that go?" Clyde glanced at his ledger. "Afternoon draw around 2 o'clock, I expect. You looking to buy?" "Thinking about it," Walter said. "Those are good animals." Clyde lowered his voice slightly in the way of a man sharing information he considers relevant. "They're a widow's stock. Husband died in the spring. I checked the paperwork, it's all in order, but there's some question as to whether she's actually been running the operation or if those animals came from somewhere else." Walter looked at him. "What kind of question?" "Just talk," Clyde said. "You know how it is." "I know how it is," Walter agreed, and he moved away from the board. He spent the rest of the morning watching the auction and making a few preliminary notes on animals he might bid on, but his attention kept returning to pen 7. He walked by it twice in the course of the morning, ostensibly to get a better look at the stock, and both times the woman was there, and both times he did not approach her, because the morning did not seem to call for it. The second time he passed, she was talking to her ranch hand, Emilio. He would later learn the name about the condition of the third steer from the left, which had a slight swelling in its left foreleg that Myrtle was watching with concern. She was asking specific, knowledgeable questions about whether the animal had been favoring the leg on the drive in or whether the swelling had appeared in the pen, and the hand was answering her with equal specificity, and the whole exchange was the conversation of two people who knew what they were talking about. It was not the conversation of a woman who had simply shown up to collect money on someone else's work. Walter went and found himself a spot near the main auction ring and waited for 2 o'clock. The afternoon auction opened with a roan mare and 2 working horses that went quickly and without drama. Then came a pen of mixed stock from a rancher named Beaumont that generated some lively bidding before settling at a fair price. Then Clyde Holt called pen 7, and Myrtle Fairchild and Emilio began moving the 11 steers through the gate and into the auction ring. The murmuring started before the animals were fully inside. It was not loud. It was the particular quiet kind of resistance that comes from a crowd of men who share an opinion and express it through the simple mechanism of not raising their hands. Myrtle had positioned herself at the edge of the ring, and Emilio stood at the gate, and she watched with a schooled expression as Clyde Holt began his call. 11 head, Fairchild brand, steers coming 3 to 4 years, good weight, fair condition, Clyde called. "Who'll start me at $30 a head?" Silence. Not the working silence of men considering. The deliberate silence of men who had already decided. Myrtle did not move. Her hands were folded in front of her and her face was composed, and the only thing that might have betrayed her was the way her jaw had set just slightly, the way a person's jaw sets when they are holding something steady by the force of their own will. $30, Clyde tried again. "Healthy animals, gentlemen, you can see them right in front of you." More silence. Someone coughed. The heavy-set man with the blonde mustache was standing near the fence with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression of idle satisfaction. Then a voice from the northeast corner of the ring said, clearly and without hesitation, "I will give you $30 a head." Myrtle turned. Walter Chandler had his right hand raised and his eyes were on the steers, not on her, in the professional manner of a man who is bidding on cattle and not performing for an audience. Clyde Holt, visibly relieved, picked up his rhythm. $30, do I hear 32? The room had shifted. The silence had been broken, and the crowd, as crowds do, began to reassess. A man near the gate raised 2 fingers. 32. 35, Walter said, still watching the animals. 35, do I hear 38? Another pause, shorter this time. 36, offered a voice from the back. 38, Walter said. The bidding climbed from there, with Walter as the steady anchor and 2 or 3 other men entering cautiously once the floor had been established. And when it was over, the steers sold at $42 a head, which was a strong price for that market, above what Myrtle had calculated as her best-case number. She stood very still for a moment after Clyde brought down the gavel, and then she walked to the exchange office to complete the paperwork. She was signing the transfer documents when she heard the door of the exchange office open, and she looked up, and the man who had bid first was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "I hope you don't mind. My name is Walter Chandler. I ranch northeast of town." "Myrtle Fairchild," she said. She kept her voice even. "Thank you for what you did out there." "I bid on good cattle," he said simply. "The rest was just bookkeeping." She looked at him for a moment. There was nothing theatrical about him. He was not performing gallantry. He was a straightforward man making a straightforward statement, and she found that she did not know quite what to do with that, because she had been braced for most of the day against the particular kind of condescension that presents itself as help, and this was not that. "It was more than bookkeeping," she said. "The room wasn't going to bid." He nodded. "I noticed. And you didn't think the animals weren't mine?" She asked because she needed to know it directly, because she was a woman who asked direct questions even when the answers might sting. "I watched you at the fence all morning," he said. "I watched how you talked about them. Those were your animals. Any man who couldn't see that wasn't looking." The exchange clerk appeared at the counter with her payment, and she turned to collect it and sign the final receipt, and when she turned back, Walter Chandler was still in the doorway, and something in her chest had shifted in a way she did not have language for yet, but she recognized it the same way you recognize weather coming before you can see the clouds. "I owe you a cup of coffee," she said, "if you have the time." "I have the time," he said. There was a small restaurant on the main street of Caldwell called Hetty's, which served coffee and beef stew and a very good apple pie, and it was a place where women could sit without being remarkable, which mattered to Myrtle because she had been remarkable enough for one day. They took a table near the window and ordered coffee, and Walter ordered pie without her having to ask whether he was hungry, which she appreciated because she was ravenous, and she had been waiting for social permission to eat. She ordered pie too. They sat for a moment in the particular silence of 2 strangers who have just been through something together and have not yet established the language for what comes next. "Tell me about your operation," she said, because she was more comfortable with practical things than with sentiment. He told her. 500 acres, cattle primary, some wheat. He had 3 hands full-time and 2 seasonal. He was building out a new barn section that he had been putting off for 2 years. He had a dog named General who was useless for cattle but excellent for company. She laughed at that. It was a small laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her face in a way that made him set down his coffee cup. "I apologize," she said. "You were serious." "No," he said, "I wasn't." He was looking at her with a kind of careful attention that was not rude but was very present, and she met his eyes and held them because she was not a woman who looked away from things. "How long has your husband been gone?" he asked, and his voice had shifted into something quieter, not pitying, respectful. 8 months, she said. "February." "I'm sorry," he said. "He was a good man," she said, "a hard worker. He deserved more time." She looked out the window at the street where a horse and wagon were passing through the afternoon light. "I have a daughter, Pearl. She is 9. She is the reason the roof needs fixing and the reason I drove those steers to market today instead of selling the land and moving to my sister's house in Missouri." "You thought about it?" he asked, not pressing, just listening. "Every rancher thinks about it," she said, "when it gets hard enough. I thought about it for about 1 week in March, and then Pearl asked me if we were going to plant the kitchen garden this year, and I said yes, and that was the end of that." He nodded, and something in his expression told her that he understood that particular kind of decision, the kind that gets made not in a grand moment but in a small one, over a question about a garden. "Tell me about your land," he said. She told him. She was surprised at how easily it came. 340 acres, the south pasture wet enough for decent grass through a dry year, the north section rocky but manageable, the creek line that marked the eastern edge, and that kept the cattle watered without her having to rely on the well. She told him about the fence repair and about Emilio and about Pearl riding alongside her with the wire and the posts, and she told it the way she lived it, plainly and without drama, and he listened the way a man listens when he is genuinely interested and not just waiting to speak. "You repaired 3 miles of fence by yourself," he said. "Pearl helped," she said. "Still," he said. She looked at him. "Women do what needs doing," she said. "Same as men." "I know it," he said, and the way he said it, without argument or excess agreement, made her believe him. They had a second cup of coffee. The afternoon light through the window had gone gold and low, the particular October gold that makes even a dusty Kansas street look like something worth painting. Emilio came to the restaurant door at 4:30 to tell her the wagon was ready when she was, and she nodded and told him she would be a few minutes, and he left without comment, because Emilio was a discreet man. "I should be getting back," she said. "Pearl will be with the neighbor's wife, but she worries when I am late." "Of course," Walter said. He reached into his vest pocket for coins to pay for the coffee, and she shook her head. "I said I owed you coffee," she said. "I meant it." He put his hands up in a small gesture of concession and watched her pay, and when they stepped outside into the October afternoon, he put his hat back on and looked out at the street and said, "Mrs. Fairchild, would it be all right if I called on your ranch?" She looked at him steadily. The question was direct, and she could see he was nervous in a very contained way, the kind of nervous that shows only in the stillness a person holds. "It would be all right," she said. She drove home with the payment in the locked box under the wagon seat and Emilio riding alongside in the long blue dusk, and Pearl was sitting on the porch of the neighbor's house 3 miles from home waiting for her. And when Pearl saw the wagon, she ran out to meet it with her serious little face split open in a grin that only appeared in its full form for her mother. Myrtle held her daughter for a long moment in the cooling air and breathed in the smell of her hair, which smelled like dust and soap, and something sweet the neighbor must have given her for supper. "Did it go well?" Pearl asked. "It went very well," Myrtle said. That night, after Pearl was asleep and the lamp was turned low, Myrtle sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and wrote down the numbers from the day. The roof money, the winter wages, the seed money, the small reserve. She wrote them in a column and added them up, and the total was what she had hoped, and she sat for a moment with the pencil in her hand, and something settled in her chest that had been braced and tense since February. Then she thought about the man in the doorway of the exchange office with his hat in his hands, and she made a small note in the margin of the ledger that said nothing significant, just a query about the northeast road to Caldwell, the distance, the condition of it, practical things. She was a practical woman, but she was also a woman who had been alive for 31 years and who knew what it felt like when something was beginning. Walter Chandler did not call on the Fairchild Ranch the following week, because a section of his north fence collapsed in the first serious windstorm of October, and he spent 4 days repairing it, which left him sunburned and exhausted and smelling of post-hole and honest labor. He did, however, write her a letter. He was not a man who wrote letters easily. He sat at his kitchen table for the better part of an evening with a sheet of paper and a bottle of ink and wrote, and discarded 3 attempts before arriving at something that said what he meant without saying more than was appropriate for the state of acquaintance they were in. He told her that he hoped the drive home had been easy and that the payment was satisfactory. He told her that he had told his ranch foreman, a man named Dove, about the Fairchild steers, and that Dove had agreed they were fine animals. He asked whether the steer with the swollen foreleg had traveled comfortably, because he had noticed her checking it in the pen, and he was curious whether it had cleared up on its own. And he said that he still intended to call on the ranch if she was agreeable, and that he would come on the second Saturday of November unless she sent word that another time suited better. He rode the letter to the post office himself rather than waiting for Dove to make the next town run, because he was impatient about it, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. Myrtle received the letter on a Wednesday and read it at the kitchen table with Pearl looking at her from across the room with the discerning eyes of a 9-year-old who had recently started paying attention to the things adults tried to keep private. "Who is it from?" Pearl asked. "A cattle buyer," Myrtle said. Pearl accepted this with visible skepticism and went back to her reader. Myrtle wrote back the same evening. The steer's leg had settled entirely by the time they reached home, she said, probably travel soreness from the drive rather than anything significant. She said the payment had been more than satisfactory and that she was grateful for the fair outcome. She said November 2nd Saturday was perfectly agreeable and that she would have coffee ready. She sealed the letter and left it in the letter box for the post rider and went to bed feeling a sensation she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet, because happiness was a thing that grew slowly in careful people, but something adjacent to it. Something like the anticipation of a good weather change, when the wind shifts and the air smells different, and you know before you can see the sky that something is coming. November came in cold and clear. Walter Chandler arrived at the Fairchild Ranch on the second Saturday at 11 in the morning, having ridden from his spread in 3 hours at a careful pace, because the road had frost on it from the night before, and he had not had this horse reshod yet. He came through the front gate and saw the house, which was a solid farmhouse of unpainted timber with a porch that ran the full width of the front, and the barn beyond it in good repair, and the fence lines running clean and tight to the south. He also saw Pearl, who was standing on the porch with her arms crossed in a posture that bore a striking resemblance to her mother's. "You must be Mr. Chandler," Pearl said. "I must be," he agreed, tying his horse at the rail. "And you must be Pearl." "She told me you were coming," Pearl said. "She made a cake." "Did she?" he said. "She does not usually make cake on Saturdays," Pearl said. "She makes it on Sundays for church." "I will take that as a good sign," Walter said. Pearl considered this with the gravity appropriate to someone performing an assessment. "She cried a lot after my father died," Pearl said, without cruelty, just stating it. "She does not cry anymore, but she is still very careful." "That is good information," Walter said, and he meant it seriously, and something in the way he said it made Pearl uncross her arms. "The coffee is inside," Pearl said, and held the door open. Myrtle was in the kitchen, and she turned when she heard the door, and there was a single unguarded moment before she composed herself in which something warm and open crossed her face. She was wearing a blue wool dress that he had not seen before, and her hair was done neatly, and she was holding a dish towel. "Mr. Chandler," she said, "you made it without trouble." "Easy road," he said. "Good morning, Mrs. Fairchild." "Myrtle," she said, and the word was a decision. "Walter," he said, and the word was an acceptance. They had coffee and cake at the kitchen table with Pearl sitting between them, eating cake and reading her reader with the practiced air of someone who was not listening while very clearly listening. Walter asked about the ranch and Myrtle showed him the ledger. She did not know what made her do it, except that it was honest and she was an honest person, and he looked at the numbers with the same focused attention he had given to the steers in the auction ring and said, "You have managed this well." "I have managed this barely," she corrected. "That is the same thing in the first year," he said. "The first year after a loss is just surviving. If you have survived it with the books in this order, you have done something significant." She looked at the ledger and then at him. "Horace would have wanted me to sell," she said. "He always said women were not made for ranching alone." "What do you think?" Walter asked. "I think he was wrong," she said quietly, "and I think he would have been glad to be wrong because he loved me and he would have wanted me to succeed." Pearl turned a page of her reader without looking up. They sat for a while in the comfortable way of two people who have found a shared frequency, and then Walter asked if he might walk the property, not from nosiness, but because he was a man who thought best on his feet, and the conversation had reached a point where doing something seemed right. Myrtle put on her coat and walked with him, and Pearl stayed on the porch with her reader and the dog, who had appeared from somewhere behind the barn. They walked the south pasture first, then the fence line, and Walter looked at her repair work with visible appreciation. She showed him the creek line and the east boundary and the rocky north section, where she was thinking of putting in a winter shelter for the next year's herd. "Where would you position it?" he asked. She pointed to the natural windbreak formed by a line of scrub cedar along the north slope. "There. It is out of the prevailing wind and close enough to the creek for water without being in the flood plain." He looked at it for a moment. "That is exactly where I would put it," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Was that a test?" "No," he said. He looked at her, and the afternoon light was doing the same thing it had done through the restaurant window in Caldwell, making everything gold and clear and significant. "I'm just constantly finding out that you know what you are doing." "You say that as if it surprises you," she said. "It does not surprise me," he said. "It impresses me. Those are different." They stood at the north fence for a moment looking out at the flat land and the wide sky, and she thought about what Pearl had said on the porch about being careful, and she thought about Horace and about February, and about the 8 months of waking up every morning and choosing to keep going, and she thought about 11 steers and a silent auction room and a hand raised in a northeast corner. "I want to say something," she said. "Go ahead," he said. "When you bid on those steers," she said, "I had been standing in that ring for 2 minutes watching men decide not to. Not because the animals weren't good, not because the paperwork wasn't in order. Because they had decided I was not a legitimate seller, and you walked in and bid full price without asking me a single question about whether I deserved it, and She stopped. She was not a woman who stumbled in speech, but she was stopping now carefully. "That mattered more than the money," she finished. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cedar scrub, and somewhere behind them the dog barked once at something in the grass. "I have a mother," he said. "She ran our ranch for 2 years after my father fell ill before I was old enough to take it over properly. 2 years on her own, with 2 boys and a crew of men who were certain she would fail. She did not fail." He looked at Myrtle. "I know what it looks like when a woman knows what she is doing and is simply being prevented from proving it. I recognize the situation." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. "Where is your mother now?" she asked. "Santa Fe," he said. "She moved there after I took the ranch. She says the light is better." "Is it?" "Probably," he said. "She is rarely wrong." They walked back to the house as the afternoon was deepening toward evening, and Walter stayed for supper because Myrtle invited him, and Pearl seconded the invitation with an authority that left no room for polite refusal. They had beans and salt pork and the rest of the cake, and the conversation covered cattle prices, and the coming winter, and the political situation in the territory, and the merits of different breeds of work dogs. And it was the best evening Walter had spent in a very long time, which he recognized and noted the same way he noted things about fence lines and pasture conditions, quietly and with a view to the future. He rode home in the cold dark with the stars very bright over the Kansas plain, and the road silver with frost, and something settled and warm in his chest that had nothing to do with the cake. He came back 2 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that. And each time the visits were a little longer and the conversation a little easier, and the silences between the talk more comfortable, which is the real measure of 2 people finding their way to each other, not the words but the quiet in between them. Emilio watched all of this with the careful invisibility of a man who was professionally discreet, though he did mention to his wife in the letter he wrote home each month that Mrs. Fairchild was looking better. His wife, who was a practical woman, wrote back and said good. Pearl had stopped pretending to read during Walter's visits and simply sat and listened openly, and occasionally she asked him questions about his ranch, with the directness of a child who has decided she is comfortable with someone. He answered her questions with the same seriousness he gave to adult questions, which Pearl recognized and responded to by gradually becoming his ally in a way that Myrtle found both touching and slightly transparent. In December, Walter came for a Sunday dinner and stayed through the afternoon, and when he left he stood at the porch rail for a moment longer than was necessary before going to his horse. And Myrtle stood in the doorway, and the cold air came in through the open door, and Pearl appeared behind her and said, very quietly, "Mama, just go talk to him." And Myrtle considered this for a moment and stepped off the porch. Walter turned when he heard her boots on the frozen ground. "I wanted to say," she said, "that I am glad you came to the market that day." He looked at her in the gray December light. "So am I," he said. "I mean, I am glad specifically that it was you," she said, because she was a woman who said what she meant. "Not just that someone bid, that you bid." He took one step toward her. "Myrtle," he said, and her name in his voice was the same as the first morning light coming through a window, something that has always been there but that you are grateful for in a particular new way. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had said but to something she already knew was coming, and it was the most decisive yes she had spoken since she had told Pearl yes about the kitchen garden, and it landed with the same weight. He took her hand in both of his. His hands were very warm for a cold day, and she thought, irrelevantly, that this was a good quality in a person. She looked up at him and he looked at her, and the whole wide Kansas sky was very still above them and cold and enormous, and they stood in it like two people who have found solid ground after walking across uncertain land for a very long time. He did not kiss her, not that day. She was a careful woman, and he was a careful man, and they were both old enough to know that the worth of a thing is not diminished by taking time with it. But he held her hand in the cold air for a long moment, and then he smiled, and it was a very good smile, wide and slightly unguarded, the smile of a man who has stopped trying to be composed about something and given into it. "I should come for Christmas," he said. "You should," she said. He came for Christmas, and he brought a small wooden horse he had made himself for Pearl, which Pearl received with the same measured gravity with which she received all things, and then went to her room and played with for the rest of the afternoon. He brought Myrtle a book of maps of the Kansas Territory, which was exactly the right gift for exactly the right person, and she held it in her hands with the same expression she had worn when she had first looked at her clean ledger numbers in October. They had a Christmas dinner that Myrtle cooked, and that Walter helped carry to the table and Pearl set the plates for, and the three of them sat around the small table in the farmhouse kitchen, with the lamp burning and the cold dark pressing at the windows, and inside it was warm and full of food smells, and the dog had somehow gotten inside, and was under the table with his head on Pearl's foot, and it was not a grand Christmas. It was a modest one in a modest house at the end of a hard year. But every person at that table was aware of how good it was. After Pearl went to bed, Myrtle and Walter sat by the fire. She had a small amount of brandy that she had been saving since the summer, a gift from Emilio's wife conveyed through Emilio, and she poured 2 small glasses, and they sat in the firelight, and the conversation eventually quieted, and they were just together in the room, the fire talking in its low voice and the wind outside and the two of them, and it was enough. More than enough. "I have something to ask you," Walter said. She looked at him. The firelight was moving across his face, and she had come to know this face over the past 3 months well enough that she could read the slight tension in it. "Ask," she said. He looked at the fire and then at her. "I know it has not been a year," he said. "I know that matters, and I know you are a woman who thinks carefully about things, which is one of the things He paused. "I am in love with you," he said, because he was a direct man and the circling was frustrating him. "I have been since approximately the moment I saw you with your notebook at that fence rail writing calculations in the margin. And I want to ask whether you would consider, not immediately, not before you are ready, but consider whether there is a future between us." Myrtle set down her brandy glass very carefully. She thought about Horace, who had deserved more time and did not get it, who had loved her in the steady way of a good man. She thought about February and about the months that had followed, the hard, lonely work of it, and the way the morning had looked when she had driven 11 steers into Caldwell with a folder of papers and a biscuit in her pocket. She thought about a hand raised in a northeast corner without hesitation. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it." "How is that going?" he asked. "Not very well," she admitted, and he laughed and she laughed, and the dog woke up from somewhere and looked at them from the doorway with confused affection. He reached across the space between them and took her hand again. "Then I will ask you properly," he said. "When you are ready, when it is right." "Don't wait too long," she said quietly. "I am done with waiting for things." He squeezed her hand. "Next spring," he said, "when the ground is thawed and the fence is mended and the world looks like itself again." "Next spring," she agreed. January was cold and relentless, and they wrote letters twice a week, and Walter came once a fortnight on horseback when the roads allowed it. And each visit was a quiet building of something that did not need to be dramatic, because it was already certain. Myrtle repaired 2 sections of the south fence herself, with Emilio's help, and Walter rode out one Sunday in late January to assist with the 3rd section. Not because she had asked him, but because he had asked whether she needed the help, and she had said yes, because she was a woman who had learned that needing help was not the same as being unable. They worked the fence together in the gray January cold, the 4 of them, Myrtle and Walter and Emilio and Pearl, who had insisted on coming, and who worked the wire with more competence than a child her age had any business possessing. At one point, Pearl handed Walter a post driver and said, "Mama showed me how to do this," with the particular pride of a child whose parent has made her capable, and Walter took the post driver and said, "Then she showed you right," and Pearl looked at him with the full, unfiltered assessment of a child who has been deciding for months and said, "I think it would be all right if you stayed." Walter looked at her. Pearl met his eyes without flinching. "That is good to hear," he said. Myrtle, who was 6 feet away tying off a wire and had heard every word, said nothing, but she was smiling at the fence post in a way that she was aware Emilio was tactfully not noticing. February came, and with it the 1st anniversary of Horace's death, and Myrtle spent that day quietly, taking Pearl to place wild grass at the churchyard grave, and walking home in the cold afternoon, and sitting for a while with the ledger book, not because she needed to check the numbers, but because having something concrete in her hands helped her think. She thought about Horace with love and with grief, and with the particular complicated grace of a person who is moving forward and is both grateful for that and tender toward what is being left behind. She wrote Walter that evening. She told him it was the anniversary and that she had visited the grave and that she was all right, but that she wanted him to know. She sent the letter the next morning. He wrote back the day he received it. He said that he was glad she had told him. He said that grief did not end, but it changed, and that the changing was not a betrayal of the person who was gone but a part of living, and that she was the most alive person he had ever met, and he thought Horace, who had clearly raised Pearl, must have loved a remarkable woman. He said that he was thinking of her, and that the letter would travel slowly, but the thinking was immediate. Myrtle read the letter twice and put it in the small cedar box where she kept Pearl's first drawings and the receipt from the cattle market in October. Spring came the way it comes to Kansas, tentatively at first, then all at once, the ground softening and the light returning and the grass beginning to push through the dead cover of the winter. By April, the south pasture was green enough to graze, and Myrtle had put in her order for spring calves from a rancher 2 counties over and had made her calculation for the summer, and the numbers looked better than the previous year. Not easy, but better, and that was progress. Walter came on a Sunday in the middle of April. He arrived on his best horse, a roan with a clean gait and a calm eye, which was not the horse he usually rode to the Fairchild place, and Myrtle noticed this but said nothing about it. They had dinner, and Pearl afterward claimed she was very tired and went to bed at an hour that was slightly implausible for a child of her energy, and Emilio had the evening off, and so Myrtle and Walter were alone in the kitchen with the spring evening coming in through the open window and the sounds of the pasture at dusk all around them. Walter stood up from the table. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not built for flowery language, and he knew it, and she knew it, and that was part of why she loved him, because she was also not built for it. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a small ring, a simple gold band set with a single garnet that was dark red and warm-looking in the lamp light. "Myrtle," he said, "I told you next spring, and it is next spring, and I am a man who means what he says." She stood up too, because sitting felt wrong for this. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "To join your ranch and mine, or to manage them separate, whichever you prefer, because they are both good operations, and I am not asking you to give up anything you have built. I am asking whether you will build something with me." He looked at her steadily. "I love you. I love Pearl. I love the way you have a pencil behind your ear when you are doing figures, and the way you talk to the cattle, and the way you told that red-faced man at the auction that you had help, good fencing and good water, and a man who knew what he was doing, and the way you are never afraid of the direct question." He stopped. "That is the end of the speech. Will you?" "Yes," she said for the second time, and this one landed with the same certainty as the first, but deeper, like the difference between seeing the rain coming and feeling it on your face. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it and then at him, and he put his arms around her, and she let him, properly this time, without carefulness, and it was very quiet in the kitchen except for the spring evening coming through the window. Pearl appeared in the doorway. She was wearing her nightdress, and she was very clearly not asleep. She said yes, Pearl asked. "Pearl," Myrtle said. "I heard very little," Pearl said virtuously. She said yes, Walter confirmed. Pearl considered this with immense satisfaction. "Good," she said, and went back to bed. They were married in June of 1883, on a Saturday morning in the Caldwell Methodist Church, with the sun coming in through the windows and the whole church smelling of the lilac that Pearl had cut from the bush behind the house and arranged in 3 mason jars on the altar. Emilio Vega sat in the front pew with his hat in his hands, which he had brought into the church only because Pearl had told him it would be rude not to attend properly. Walter's foreman Dove came down from the ranch, a weathered man of 50 with a quiet face who shook Myrtle's hand after the ceremony with a gravity that told her he understood the significance of what had just happened. Walter's mother did not come from Santa Fe because the journey was long, but she sent a letter that arrived the week before, and that Walter read to Myrtle at the kitchen table with a slight catch in his voice that he did not try to hide, because she had written, among other things, that any woman who drove 11 steers to market and stood in that auction ring with her spine straight, while men decided not to bid, was a woman worth having, and that she was proud of her son for seeing it. Myrtle cried a little at that. She was not a woman who cried easily, but Walter's mother had said it exactly right. The question of the ranches had been practical, and they had handled it practically. They would keep both properties, running them as connected operations under the Fairchild Chandler name, with Emilio managing the Fairchild land and Dove managing the Chandler section, and Walter splitting his time between them as needed, and Myrtle doing the books for both because she was the better bookkeeper, and this was simply true, and Walter said so without embarrassment. They had discussed it over the kitchen table with a bottle of ink and 2 ledgers and Pearl asleep in the next room, and they had come to an arrangement that was fair to both of them, and that did not require either of them to disappear into the other. This had surprised several people in Caldwell who had opinions about how a widow should manage the aftermath of remarriage. Myrtle was aware of these opinions. She found them approximately as relevant as she had found the silent auction room in October, which was to say not very. After the wedding they had a supper at the Fairchild house, because it was slightly larger than the Chandler house and Myrtle's kitchen was better equipped. And Dove and Emilio both stayed for it, and Pearl stayed up past her usual time, because Myrtle allowed it and sat at the table with the adults, and ate an enormous amount of roast chicken, with the focused determination of someone who intended to have the full experience of the evening. Walter and Myrtle sat close together at the table in the way of people who are still adjusting to the fact that closeness is now simply where they are, that they do not have to travel to reach each other. He kept his hand near hers on the table. Occasionally their fingers touched. It was a small thing and a large thing simultaneously. That night, after Dove had ridden back to the Chandler place, and Emilio had gone to his quarters and Pearl was asleep, they sat on the porch in the June dark with the stars very dense and bright over the Kansas plain and the air smelling of cut grass and warm earth, and it was one of those hours that do not need anything added to them, that are complete as they are. "I want to tell you something," Myrtle said. "Tell me," he said. "When I drove those steers into Caldwell," she said, "I was not frightened. I want you to know that. I was braced and I was prepared for difficulty, but I was not frightened. Because I had done the work and I knew the animals were mine and the papers were in order and the only thing that could go wrong was other people's poor judgment." She looked at the stars. "But I was alone in a way that I had not been before, and when you raised your hand she stopped. I was still not frightened, but I was less alone." He looked at her. "That is the most important thing anyone has ever said to me," he said, and he meant it absolutely, and she knew it. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stayed on the porch in the June dark for a very long time. Just that, just together, which was entirely sufficient. The summer of 1883 was a good one, dry enough to be manageable and wet enough to be productive, and the Fairchild Chandler operation ran smoothly in the way that things run when people know what they are doing and trust each other. Walter and Myrtle fell into the rhythms of shared work with the ease of two people whose rhythms had always been compatible without their knowing it. He deferred to her on the south pasture management because she knew that land better. She asked his advice on the calving schedule because he had more experience with the timing. They debated the question of the new barn roof for 2 evenings and arrived at the same conclusion from different angles, and Walter said, "We arrived at the same conclusion," and Myrtle said, "We usually do," with a satisfaction in her voice that was not about winning, but about being understood. Pearl adapted to the changed household with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who has been thinking ahead of everyone else. She called Walter Mr. Chandler for the first month and then shifted to Walter, without ceremony and without being asked, and Walter accepted this with equal absence of ceremony, and it was simply what it was. She did not call him anything in place of Papa, because Horace had been her father and she kept that distinct, and Walter never suggested otherwise because he understood it. In the fall, Myrtle drove cattle to Caldwell again. 14 steers this time, the result of the spring calves and good summer management. Walter came with her. Clyde Holt met them at the exchange gate with a slightly chastened expression, as though the previous year was something he was aware of but had no language to properly address, and he registered the 14 steers without any significant delay and without any questions about whose animals they were, and Myrtle completed the paperwork and walked out into the auction yard, and Walter walked beside her. The heavy-set man with the blonde mustache was there again. He saw them together and nodded at Walter in the way of men acknowledging other men, and glanced at Myrtle, and she looked back at him with the polite, entirely level expression of a woman who is keeping score and is winning. The steers sold at $45 a head, which was a stronger price than the previous year because the animals were even better conditioned, and because the market knew the Fairchild Chandler brand by now, and it was a brand associated with quality. The bidding was brisk from the start. Afterward they had coffee and pie at Hetty's, the same restaurant, the same table near the window, the same October light. But this time they were sitting on the same side of the situation, instead of across it from each other, and Myrtle had her ledger out, and was writing the numbers, and Walter was watching her write them and drinking his coffee, and the whole afternoon was quietly and completely right. "Better than last year," she said. "Better than last year," he agreed. "Next year I want to send 20 head," she said. "I think the pasture can support it if we manage the winter grazing carefully." "Show me your calculation," he said, and she turned the ledger and showed him, and he looked at it and made one small notation, and she looked at it and nodded, and they agreed on the number. 20 head. They drove home in the late afternoon with the payment in the locked box, and the sun going down red over the flat land, and the road ahead of them empty and familiar. By November of 1883, Myrtle knew she was expecting a child. She told Walter on a Tuesday morning while they were drinking coffee before the day's work began, because she was not a woman who built to announcements. She simply stated things when they were true. Walter set his coffee cup down. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly: surprise, and then something so full and warm that she had to look away from it for a moment. "Are you well?" he said. "Very well," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her, and held her face in his hands, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on any face before, not even Horace's, though she held that comparison gently. It was an expression of complete and utter love, uncomplicated and without performance. "Myrtle," he said, and did not finish the sentence, because the sentence was only her name. She put her hands over his and held them there. Pearl received the news at supper with a long pause and then said, "I would prefer a brother," with the directness that was entirely her mother's. Walter said he would see what could be arranged, and Pearl said that was not how it worked, and they all laughed, and it was the easiest and best supper they had had, which was saying something because most of their suppers were good. The winter passed with the particular combination of hard cold and warm interior that makes a house feel like itself. Myrtle managed the books and directed the winter operations from the kitchen when the weather made the fields impractical, and Walter rode between the two ranches keeping the crews on task, and Emilio managed the Fairchild pasture with the quiet competence that had kept those 11 steers alive through the summer of grief, for which Myrtle was continuously grateful. She had given him a raise in the fall, and he had accepted it with a dignity that suggested he had been expecting it and had not been certain she would remember, and she wanted to be the kind of employer who remembered. In the spring of 1884, on an evening in late April when the Kansas sky was putting on one of its enormous and extravagant sunset performances, Myrtle gave birth to a boy. They named him Thomas, for Walter's father, and he was born healthy and loud and with an immediate strong opinion about everything, which Myrtle said was entirely his father's doing, and Walter said was entirely his mother's. And Pearl stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at her baby brother with an expression that was trying very hard to be merely interested and was in fact completely besotted. "He is smaller than I expected," Pearl said. "You were smaller," Myrtle said. "I do not believe that," Pearl said. But she came forward and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Thomas with the seriousness she brought to all important things. And after a moment she put one finger very gently against his fist, and his fist closed around it. And Pearl looked up at her mother, and her face was entirely undone, open and young and full of something pure. Walter was sitting on the other side of the bed with his hand on Myrtle's shoulder, and he looked at his wife and his son and his stepdaughter. And the room was full of the April evening light, and the sound of the spring outside, and he was aware, in the particular way of a man who has been fortunate and knows it, that this was everything. The Fairchild Chandler operation grew steadily over the next years. By 1886, they were driving 30 head to the Caldwell market annually, and their brand was known well enough that the buyers approached them rather than the other way around. And the day that Clyde Holt came to them at the pen, rather than waiting for them at the gate, was a day Myrtle noted in her ledger with a satisfaction she felt no need to suppress. They built the new barn section on the north pasture, the one Myrtle had planned from the beginning, in the summer of 1885, And Walter and Emilio and Dove and 2 seasonal hands put it up in 10 days. And Myrtle and Pearl and Thomas, who was by then old enough to run around with genuine purpose, watched the frame go up in the morning light, and Myrtle stood with her hand on the fence rail and felt the particular joy of a plan becoming solid in the world. Walter came and stood beside her. "You planned this in October 1882, he said. "I did," she said. "Before I even came to call," he said. "That is correct," she said. He put his arm around her. "I love you very specifically," he said, which was not a sentence that made immediate grammatical sense but which she understood completely, because she loved him the same way, not generally, not for his category or his helpfulness or his arrival at the right moment, but specifically for the way he set down his coffee cup when he heard something he needed to think about, and the way he talked to the cattle in a low, continuous voice when he was checking on them in the early morning, and the way he had made a wooden horse for Pearl, and the way he had said her name in the doorway of the exchange office, and the way he had said it again in the farmhouse kitchen, and the way he said it now. Always with the same quality of attention, as though it was the first time and also a very settled, familiar thing simultaneously. In the spring of 1887, they had their second child, a girl this time, and Pearl held her immediately and declared her name should be Clara, which was the name of a character in the reader Pearl had worn out to the spine in 1883, and Myrtle looked at Walter and Walter looked at Myrtle, and Clara was her name. Thomas, who was 3, regarded Clara with the bewildered suspicion of a child who had been the center of the universe, and was receiving information that this might not be entirely accurate. He came around to her within a week, and thereafter appointed himself her primary guardian with a ferocity that Pearl found slightly excessive, and that Walter found entirely understandable. Emilio Vega was still with them. He had brought his wife north in 1884, and she was part of the ranch community now, a sturdy, cheerful woman named Rosa who grew the best kitchen garden in the county, and who had befriended Myrtle with the directness of a person who recognizes a compatible spirit. Rosa and Myrtle had fought together through the dry summer of 1885 over the irrigation question, and won, and that victory had cemented a friendship that was one of the genuine pleasures of Myrtle's daily life. Dove had retired from the Chandler section in 1886, his knees giving out after 30 years of ranch work, and Walter had brought in a younger foreman named Bauer who was 27 and very good with horses, and who called Myrtle Mrs. Chandler Fairchild with scrupulous correctness, which made her smile every time because no one else in the county managed to say both names. Pearl turned 17 in 1890 and was accepted to the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia, which was a thing she had been planning since she was 11. Myrtle sat at the kitchen table the evening they received the letter and read it 3 times, and Pearl sat across from her with her composed face doing its best work, and Myrtle put the letter down and said, "Your father would have been so proud," and Pearl said, "Walter is proud," and Myrtle said, "Both of them," and Pearl said, "Yes," and they looked at each other with the complete understanding of 2 women who have raised each other. Walter drove Pearl to Emporia in September of 1890, 3 days in the wagon, and Myrtle sent biscuits enough for both of them and a letter for Pearl that she sealed and told her to read on the second night. Pearl later told her she had read it on the first night because she was not a person who waited for things, and that it had made her cry, and that she was grateful. Walter came back without Pearl and the house was notably quieter, and he sat down at the kitchen table and Myrtle poured him coffee and sat across from him, and they were quiet together for a while. "She is going to be formidable," Walter said. "She already is," Myrtle said. Thomas was 6 by then and Clara was 3, and the house was not actually quiet because Thomas ran everywhere, and Clara was developing the same forthright conversational style as her mother and her sister. And Walter had given Thomas a very small pocket knife for his birthday, which Myrtle had complex feelings about but had permitted because She had watched Walter teach Thomas to use it with the same patience he brought to everything that mattered. The cattle operation by 1890 was one of the solid mid-sized ranches of Sumner County, known for quality stock and fair dealing. The Fairchild Chandler name in the Caldwell Livestock Exchange meant something specific and valuable. The buyers who had sat silent in that ring in October of 1882 were either gone from the business or, in a few cases, were now buyers of Fairchild Chandler cattle, which Myrtle noted with a private and entirely justified satisfaction. She still brought the cattle to market herself, or most years she did. Walter came with her sometimes, and sometimes she went with Emilio, and sometimes, in recent years, with Thomas riding beside her with his serious young face set on the horizon, learning to watch and understand. She had not been kept from the market in 8 years. She had not been questioned at the exchange gate since the year after the wedding. The world had not changed entirely. She was realistic about that. There were still auction rooms and county boards and bank counters where women were invisible or obstructed or simply not taken seriously. But in this particular county and this particular exchange and this particular operation, Myrtle Fairchild had established the ground she stood on, and she stood on it without apology. She thought sometimes about that morning in October of 1882, the cold air and the folder of papers and the biscuit in her pocket and the auction ring, and the silence of men who had decided without looking. She thought about the hand raised in the northeast corner. She thought about how the whole day had pivoted on a single moment of someone seeing clearly and acting on what they saw. She thought about it one particular evening in October of 1891, a full 9 years after that first cattle market day, when she was sitting on the porch in the autumn dark and Walter came out and sat beside her and said, "You're quiet." "Thinking," she said. "About what?" "About 9 years ago," she said, "this time of year." He was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell," he said. "Caldwell," she agreed. He looked out at the dark pasture, where the sound of the cattle moving slowly in the night was a steady and comfortable thing. "Do you know what I thought when I saw you at that fence rail?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "I thought, whoever that woman is, she knows exactly what those animals are worth and she knows exactly what they cost her to bring here and she is going to sell them at the right price or she is going to make someone very sorry." He paused. "And then I thought, I want to know what she is writing in the margins of that notebook." She laughed. The laugh was easy and full, different from the small, surprised laugh of 9 years ago in Hetty's restaurant. This was the laugh of a woman who was entirely at home in her life. "Tax calculations," she said, "and a note about the north fence." "Of course it was," he said, and he was smiling in the dark and she could hear it in his voice. He took her hand on the porch rail. His hands were still very warm. She had noticed this in 9 years of November mornings and January fence lines and April dawns. He was always warm, which she had decided early on was one of the very best things about him. "Myrtle," he said. "Yes," she said, which was what she always said when he said her name that way, because it was always the right answer. "I would do it again," he said, "every day. I would walk into every silent auction room on the plains and bid on your cattle every day without hesitation, because they were yours and you were there and you deserved to be seen." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the October dark. "You only had to do it once," she said. "That was enough." "It was," he said. "It was enough to change everything." The autumn air smelled of dried grass and river mud, and the particular kind of distance that opens up in the Kansas plain when the sky goes dark, and the stars come out so numerous and bright that the land seems to rise up toward them. Inside the house the lamp was burning, and Thomas was doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, with the concentrated frown of a boy who finds arithmetic irksome, but is determined not to admit it. And Clara was asleep in her room with her stuffed calico horse. And Pearl was in Emporia, and had written 2 weeks ago that she had met a very interesting young man studying law who was originally from Ohio, and that she was not yet prepared to say more about it, but that her mother would be the first to know. Myrtle had written back and said she was ready to hear everything when Pearl was ready to say it, and that she was not going to rush her, and that she hoped the young man from Ohio was a person who listened well, because Pearl deserved a person who listened well. Walter had read the letter over her shoulder and said, "Ohio," and Myrtle had said, "Yes," and Walter had said, "Does he know anything about cattle?" And Myrtle had said, "We will find out," and they had smiled at each other in the way they always did now, the way of two people who have been through enough together that the smiles carry everything that would take hours to say. On the porch in the October dark, Myrtle looked out at the pasture, and the stars and the wide familiar landscape of the life she had built, repaired, defended, expanded, and shared. 340 acres that had been Horace's dream and her survival, and then her own full-hearted enterprise. 500 acres adjoining it that had been Walter's inheritance and his steadiness and his future. Together 1,000 acres that fed cattle and grew wheat and carried 2 children and housed 1 dog and employed people she trusted and produced something each year that she could write in the ledger with the satisfaction of a person who has done honest work well. She thought about the biscuit in her pocket on the morning of October 1882. She had been so hungry that day and so determined not to show it, and she had eaten it standing at the fence rail between the registration and the auction while she looked at her notes, and it had been a very good biscuit, cold by then but still good, the kind she made with salt and lard and a little sugar, the kind Pearl had learned to make at her side, and that Thomas was now learning although he put too much salt in. She thought about standing in that auction ring and watching the silence spread through the room like cold water. She thought about the hand in the northeast corner. She turned and looked at Walter on the porch beside her, his profile dark against the stars, his hand warm around hers. "Thank you," she said, which she had said before in different forms in different moments but never without meaning it completely. "For what in particular?" he asked. "For not asking any questions," she said. "That morning, before you bid. You did not come over to the pen and ask me whether I had the papers, or whether Horace had left the ranch to me properly, or whether Emilio was the one who had really run the operation. You looked at the animals and at me and you raised your hand. That was the whole of it." He was quiet for a moment. "The animals told the story," he said. "The rest was other people's problem." She pressed his hand. The stars were very numerous and the cattle were settling in the pasture and the lamp inside was steady and warm, and the whole night was full of the quiet sounds of a working ranch at peace with itself. "Come inside," she said. "Thomas will need help with the arithmetic, and I promise Clara a story before she goes to sleep even though she is already asleep and will never know I didn't tell it." "I'll tell it anyway," he said. "She'll want to know in the morning what the story was." She stood and pulled him up by the hand, and they went inside together into the warm lamp light, and the door closed behind them on the October dark, and the ranch settled into its night sounds, and the ledger on the kitchen table had good numbers in it, and the cedar box on the shelf had its letters and receipts and Pearl's drawings, and the ring on Myrtle's finger caught the lamplight when she reached for the kettle. And Walter was reading over Thomas's arithmetic with a patient and slightly concerned expression, and Clara's door was cracked open just enough to hear her breathing, and the dog was under the table because he was always under the table, and the whole wide Kansas night was. Outside, enormous and full of stars, and inside it was everything that mattered, warm and real and entirely theirs. In the spring of 1893, Pearl wrote from Emporia to say that she was engaged to be married to the young man from Ohio, whose name was Henry Alcott, and that he was a good listener, and that he had indeed no direct experience with cattle, but was willing to learn, and had asked Pearl what her mother would think of him, to which Pearl had replied that her mother would ask him one question, and the answer would tell her everything she needed to know. Pearl did not include the question in the letter, only that Henry had answered it well. Myrtle wrote back and asked what the question was. Pearl wrote back and said the question was, when you walk into a room and you see someone being treated unfairly, what do you do? Henry had said, "You do something. That is all there is to it. You do something." Myrtle read the letter at the kitchen table, and Walter came in from the morning and looked at her face and said, "Good news." She handed him the letter. He read it standing at the kitchen counter. He set it down. "He'll do," Walter said. "He'll do," Myrtle agreed. Henry Alcott came to the Fairchild Chandler ranch in June of that year. A tall, quiet young man of 26 with an honest face and serious eyes. And he shook Walter's hand and looked Myrtle very directly in the face and said, "Miss Pearl has told me about your cattle operation and your management of the exchange, and I am very glad to meet you, ma'am," with the particular sincerity of someone who has been told the full story and has understood its significance. Myrtle liked him immediately. She showed him the south pasture and the north barn and the ledger system and the brand registry, and he looked at all of it with genuine attention and asked good questions. And Pearl walked beside them with the expression of a woman who is watching two people she loves meet each other and is very pleased with how it is going. Thomas, who was 9 by then, decided within the first hour that Henry was acceptable and spent the rest of the visit following him around and asking him questions about Ohio with the focused curiosity of a boy who is collecting information. Clara, who was 6, told Henry that his name was funny but that his hat was nice, which Henry received as the compliment it was intended to be. Pearl and Henry were married in September of 1893 in the same Caldwell Methodist Church where Myrtle and Walter had been married 10 years before, with the same afternoon light coming through the windows and the same smell of grass and summer ending and beginning. Myrtle stood in the front pew and watched her daughter marry, and Pearl was beautiful and composed and entirely herself, which was the most Pearl thing she could be. And Myrtle was grateful for every year of it, the serious face on the porch and the wire and the fence posts, and the reader worn to the spine, and the normal school and the letter about a young man from Ohio. Walter stood beside Myrtle with his hand on the small of her back, and she reached back and pressed his hand once, and he understood everything she meant by it. After the wedding, standing outside the church in the September afternoon while Henry and Pearl talked with Henry's family who had come down from Ohio for the occasion, Thomas appeared at Walter's elbow and said, in the straightforward manner of a boy who had been thinking about something and had reached a conclusion, "I want to learn everything about the cattle operation. I want to run it properly when I am grown." Walter looked at him. Thomas was 9 years old and entirely serious. "You should tell your mother that," Walter said. "She is the one to learn it from." Thomas considered this. "I know," he said. "She already knows I want to. She has been teaching me." He paused. "But I wanted you to know too." Walter put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I know," he said. "I think you are going to be very good at it." Thomas nodded, satisfied, and went to find Clara, who had gotten into the wedding cake prematurely and needed managing. The September afternoon lay over the town of Caldwell golden and warm and long, and the shadows of the church stretched across the grass, and Myrtle looked at her family gathered in the light, and felt the full weight of what 11 steers and a folder of papers and one raised hand had set in motion, not as a chain of causes and effects, but as something more organic than that. The way a planted seed does not cause the tree, but is where the tree begins. She found Walter at the edge of the gathering, talking with Emilio, who had come for the wedding with Rosa and their daughter, who was 12 and very shy and had spent the morning playing with Clara. Walter looked up when Myrtle approached, and his face did the thing it always did, the slight brightening, the immediate attention, as though no matter how many years of ordinary mornings and ordinary evenings passed between them, he was always glad to see her arrive. She stood beside him, and Rosa was talking about the kitchen garden, and Emilio was agreeing with everything Rosa said in the mild and strategic way of a husband who has learned which arguments are worth having. And the afternoon light was doing everything it knew how to do, and Myrtle thought of all the things she had been afraid of losing, and all the things she had refused to let go of, and all the things that had come from the refusal, and she thought she would not trade a single cold morning of it. "What are you thinking?" Walter asked quietly under the conversation. "About October," she said. He smiled. "You are always thinking about October." "I am thinking about the specific October when everything changed," she said. "I know," he said. He put his arm around her right there in the September afternoon with the whole gathered family, and the Vega family, and the Ohio Alcotts and Thomas in the distance managing Clara who had cake on her face. "So am I." The sun moved west over the Kansas plain and the gathering slowly dispersed, and Pearl and Henry climbed into the wagon for the drive to Emporia where they would make their life. And Pearl hugged her mother for a long time in the dust of the road, and Myrtle held her and breathed in the smell of her hair, which had changed from the dust and soap of childhood into something more settled, though Pearl was still in it unmistakably, still and always Pearl. "You raised me right," Pearl said into her mother's shoulder. "You helped," Myrtle said. They let go. Pearl climbed up beside Henry. The wagon moved down the road, and Pearl looked back once and lifted her hand, and Myrtle lifted hers. And then the wagon turned south and the dust came up around it, and the Kansas afternoon swallowed them into the distance. And Thomas was beside Myrtle now, and Clara was holding her hand, and Walter was a step behind her with his hand on her back, warm and steady, exactly where he always was. They drove home to the ranch in the long September dusk. The cattle were in the south pasture, and the barn was solid, and the lamp was unlit in the kitchen window, because they had been away all day. And the whole place had the specific quality of a place that is waiting comfortably for the people who belong in it. Myrtle unlocked the door and went in first and lit the lamp, and the kitchen came up warm and familiar around her. The table and the ledger and the cedar box on the shelf, and the pencil that was always on the window sill above the kitchen basin, and the smell of the house, which smelled like everything that had happened in it. She put the kettle on. Walter came in and hung his hat on the nail by the door and sat down at the table and looked at her in the kitchen light with the full and entirely uncomplicated love of a man who has sat at this table for 10 years and intends to sit at it for many more. Thomas sat down and took out his school arithmetic without being asked. Clara climbed into her chair and said, "I ate too much cake." And Walter said, "I know." And Clara said, "It was worth it." And Walter said, "It usually is." Myrtle poured the water and waited for the kettle, and outside the September evening was turning to dark, and the stars were coming out one by one over the Kansas plain, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and somewhere down the southern road Pearl and Henry were driving toward their life, and the ranch was whole and warm and full of the specific sound of people who belonged to each other. She looked at the cedar box on the shelf, the auction receipt from October 1882, the ring box, Pearl's drawings, the letter from Walter's mother. She would put this day in there too, she thought. She would put all the days in there. Walter looked up from the table as though he had heard the thought. "All right?" he asked. "All right," she said, and poured the tea and sat down, and the lamp burned steadily in the window of the Fairchild Chandler ranch, and the night came on, and it was good, all of it, from the first cold morning to this warm last light, good and certain and entirely their own.